You battled the weather, the climate, circumstances to be here to listen to our esteemed speaker, Peter Klein, talk about Donald Trump, which is in and of itself a fairly captivating subject matter. My name is Adel Skander, and I'm a faculty member in the School of Communication. I also have the distinct pleasure of being the co-director of the Global Communication MA double degree program, which is a collaborative program with a partner institution in China, the Communication University of China, and it's based in Beijing. And we are the co-sponsors of this event with a group of other institutions that I'm going to name, but I want to say first and foremost, I wanted to recognize that we are here convened today on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, for whom we are in grave debt, immense gratitude, and ceaseless solidarity. We thank them for their kindness in allowing us to live, work, and play in their ancestral, mortal, and eternal homeland. Like so many of our great events here at SFU, so many people contribute to them, and the collaborative spirit that makes it possible for such incredible collegiality and a sense of commitment to community, social justice, and urgency of the moment is the reason why we are here today. This event is exemplary of this particular spirit. Many departments have collaborated to make this talk possible, both the Global Communication MA program, the School of Communication where it is housed, the School for International Studies, and I want to express special gratitude to Tamara Mustafa, the Institute for the Humanities, and particularly Samir Gandesha, SFU's Van City for Office for Community Engagement, Media Democracy Project, and especially Bob Hackett, who's here with us today, as well as Stuart Point, and of course our guest speaker's very own Global Reporting Center at the University of British Columbia. So I thank everybody for making this possible. Today's presentation is entitled Global Reporting in the Age of Trump, and I wanted to take an opportunity to kind of offer some brief remarks on the subject matter before opening up the platform for our esteemed speaker. I think it's important for us to situate the phenomenon that is Donald Trump in the context of media history. We have since forgotten that there's been a long history of right-wing talk radio, Fox News under Roger Ailes. A lot of this is, in our presentist obsession with how things keep unfolding, we keep forgetting that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The view of the media as inherently liberal, quote-unquote, dates back to the argument by Bernard Goldberg in his book Bias, and of course other volumes such as Arrogance, Rescuing America from the Media Elite. From this point forth, we have a growing sort of disparagement of mainstream media, but also the more independent, forward-thinking, progressive, and alternative underground community media. Partisanship, it becomes an imperative part of a seemingly objective but really liberal-leaning mainstream media. Trump's persona is one such complicated phenomenon. He has presented himself as an underdog. He's somehow and miraculously shed the image of a wealthy entrepreneur who is detached from people's realities and instead replaced that with a people's person, an individual who is acting on behalf and in support of the struggles of everyday life. Instead, he derives his talking points from the quote-unquote plight of the people, as odd as it sounds. He's a media phenomenon from the days of The Apprentice. His brand is not that of a likable, warm, friendly, fuzzy, compassionate individual, but rather a ruthless, unapologetic, brash, know-it-all puppeteer. But his brand has worked for him all along. Political correctness as a form is seen as a form of deception. So what is politically correct is seen as politically incorrect is seen as more authentic and speaking one's mind. In the age of unscripted gaffes, reality television, brutal divisiveness in online forums, and political brinksmanship, being unhinged is seen as authentic, and Donald Trump is exemplary of that. One could go on for a long time about perception in media, whether it's the mainstream media in the United States appraisal of Donald Trump throughout the last year and a half, and the extent to which he was perceived as journalism's persona non grata, and how he has fetishistically taken advantage of it and rendered himself an unencumbered individual, someone who, as if he was sort of coated in some real, some Vaseline, like things keeps kind of slipping off of him. Trump made it very clear that journalism is a problem all along, and even expressed an overt hostility towards journalists. In some cases, even explicitly inciting against them. Much like Bernie Sanders, whose overt critique of the mainstream media establishment improved his chances and increased his credibility with his followers. The difference, however, between the two is that performative demagoguery of Trump, who exploited scandal, negative press, and fear to attract followers, which got him that same mainstream media establishment's attention, but however, he was able to tap into a fetishistic obsession with elite and power. The amalgam of media configuration, Trump's impeccable media theatrics, and the negative view of the media has changed his fortunes, and unfortunately, all of ours. One could, again, also talk about Trump's scandals and his ability to prevail, and also how he's perceived internationally in the press. The more critique he got internationally, the more he was able to utilize that to tap into sort of a growing ultra-nationalist fervor and a jingoistic patriotism domestically. Now, how will the media reflect on Trump in the coming years? Who knows? It's anyone's guess. But if I were to throw this out there, perhaps for Peter to consider contemplating in the Q&A, can Trump be considered a complicated media personality, one who will utilize the ridicule and the mockery and the criticism and the admonishment that he gets from the mainstream media to generate a growing sort of counter-establishment of rabid loyalists who themselves can be part of the reason why there is a new anti-professionalism mantra in the media. Now, for those of us who are interested in progressive and independent media, the critique of professionalism is something that we have often celebrated. But now we have another form or another iteration of that is deeply worrying and disconcerting. In an era of post-truth, alternative facts, and fake news, we are right now at the cusp of needing to reconceptualize and rethink what it means to be doing journalism in the age of Trump, but not only that, but to think about how this can be refracted through the lens of global reporting. And there's no better person who can speak to us about this today than our guest speaker. Peter Klein is the founder of the Global Reporting Center, a nonprofit focused on producing and innovating journalism on underreported issues around the world. He is the former director of UBC's Graduate School of Journalism, where he continues to teach to this day. He teaches the International Reporting course, in which his students spend a year reporting on a global topic and partnering with major media. He was a longtime producer at CBS News, 60 Minutes, and is a regular opinion contributor to the Globe and Mail. He is the recipient of numerous journalism awards, and really this is a very, very abridged introduction for Peter. But he's the recipient of numerous journalism awards, including Emmys, Murrows, and Sigma Delta Chi awards, and he has a Master of Science in Journalism from Columbia University. So it's a real pleasure and delight to have you here. Welcome to SFU.
Thanks for inviting me. I was a little worried that there's so much to talk about regarding Trump, and I've narrowed really down on one little aspect, but you gave a great overview of all of the complexities around Donald Trump and sort of living in a world in which Donald Trump is potentially the most powerful person around. I'm going to be speaking specifically about global reporting in the age of Trump. I will admit I hate the title of this talk. I came up with this title, but I hate it because I think it fits into the same problem that we all fall into, which is our lives, our media, our brains have been hijacked by Donald Trump. It's hard to go through a dinner conversation without him being brought up. It's virtually impossible to watch the news without him being a central focus of it. Even comedy shows. I cannot remember the last time I watched a comedy show that didn't actually not just start with, but get monopolized by Trump. Until yesterday. Yesterday was the first time I had seen it, so I took this opportunity. I'm talking about Trump today. I was very excited, and I did a capture of this, so I will show you this brief little clip. The first story on The Daily Show last night.
We begin tonight with terror in the skies.
United Airlines sparking outrage for refusing to let girls on a plane, all because they were wearing leggings.
The outrage began at Denver Airport Sunday when 2 girls were denied entry onto a United flight by the gate agent. The reason? They were wearing spandex leggings. Passenger Shannon Watts tweeting, "She's forcing them to change or put dresses on over leggings or they can't board. Since when does United police women's clothing?"
You know why this story was in the news? It's because Donald Trump wasn't able to repeal Obamacare. That's why it was in the news. Yeah, so everyone was able to relax enough to go back to pre-Trump outrage. We all woke up and we were like, yes, we're not gonna die tomorrow. What's in the news? Leggings sexism, I'm outraged! It's a different feeling. It's a different feeling.
So this is what we've come to. We savor legging outrage. I myself have been a victim of the hijack of Donald Trump. I spent many months of my life last year working on a project for the New York Times about Barack Obama. I don't know if you remember him, but he was the president the last time, and he used the Espionage Act, a law that was meant to go after spies, an unprecedented number of times, more times than all presidents combined, to go after whistleblowers. So, people of a certain political persuasion were aware of this, but this was not a terribly well-known mainstream issue, including Edward Snowden. A number of people, whistleblowers, had come under this Espionage Act. So I spent months of my life last year chasing the story, pursuing it, interviewing everyone from Daniel Ellsberg from the Pentagon Papers to Snowden's lawyer, to Thomas Drake, the first person who the Obama administration had gone after, a totally innocent guy. Cut the piece. It was all ready to run on the New York Times as this video and print project. We were going to run it right after the election, when of course Hillary was going to be president, and we were going to look at this legacy of Obama and would Hillary continue this legacy. And it seemed like she probably would have, because she was quite kind of law and order when it came to whistleblowers herself, and felt like Snowden himself should be locked in prison for life. But of course that story was no longer relevant as soon as Donald Trump became president, and that whole story of Obama has become forgotten about. So I'll show you leakers, his obsession with leakers, and so it was one of those one of many examples where a very legitimate story and a legitimate gripe with the outgoing president gets overshadowed by more dramatic things that Donald Trump does, so all we end up talking about is Trump. And at the sacrificing other really important issues. I'll sort of skip these clips, and if we can get something sorted out, I'll play the rest of them. But I'll sort of flip through a few of the other non-video examples. This one probably doesn't play either. I guess start looking at him. So as Adele had mentioned, the Wi-Fi? No, it's not. It's actually just an embedded video. That's the problem. It's a movie file. So, but it doesn't seem to be playing off of the.
Do you have the files in your thumb drive?
I have it on my computer, but I can't connect it. Anyway, it's fine. Maybe they can find an HDMI cable. I can hook my computer up. But I'll go through a couple of examples. So there's so many examples of Trump hijacking our narratives that I have others to show. As Adele mentioned, I run the Global Reporting Center. I started this nonprofit that launched last June that is nominally based at UBC right now, and our goal is to look at important undercovered global issues. So literally the opposite of Trump. Trump is the least undercovered issue. We want to cover all sorts of other big global issues that get ignored. But I will admit that it's been very, very difficult to cover the rest of the world when Donald Trump is there. It's like if there's a minor leak in your faucet, but there's a fire on the other side of the room. It's hard to kind of worry about dealing with, let's fix that faucet, you've got to put out that fire. And Donald Trump is spreading fire. So right after the election, I actually happened to have a number of phone calls booked with a number of major foundations in the States to talk about funding for our Global Reporting Center. And consistently, the conversations I had with them, it would start out with this sort of deep sigh, and they'd say, we are just rethinking our very existence in light of Donald Trump winning. First of all, we funded millions of dollars worth of nonprofit journalism that doesn't seem to have made much of a difference in terms of impacting policy and reaching outside of the kind of the usual liberal East Coast and perhaps West Coast elites. So they were rethinking their kind of role in society. And also, what is journalism? What kind of journalism should they be funding? And those conversations have certainly continued for the months since Trump has been elected, and I think there's still a lot of hand-wringing about what journalists should be doing. On the other hand, you've seen organizations like the Washington Post and to some extent the New York Times doubling down on covering Trump, coming up with slogans like "democracy dies in the dark," as though whatever it was that for the Washington Post had come up with, and really starting to kind of emerge and speak directly about what's going on domestically. But nevertheless, global issues end up getting neglected. I'll give a couple examples of how we ourselves have been hijacked. Here's a project that one of our colleagues at the Global Reporting Center, Shana Plout, and I have been working on. She's actually spoken about this project at SFU. It's called Strangers at Home. It's a series of small crowdsourced video projects about the rise of xenophobia and nativism in Europe, in a wide range of communities, Roma, Jewish, Muslim, immigrant, refugee, as well as, we heard from various fascist groups, and we gave the power over to them to tell their own stories. We created about a dozen little short videos so far. We want to continue developing them, but there's a dramatic difference between the pre-Trump videos and the ones that people are pitching now and people are working on, because of course, even in Europe, the whole Donald Trump phenomenon has bled into those conversations. It's very difficult to talk about the political landscape in countries like France without referencing the Donald Trump phenomenon and what that may or may not do to conditions in Europe. Another project that Tara Sutton is one of our collaborators, lives in Jordan, and has been working outside of her journalism world. She's been working with refugees for a number of years, Syrian refugees in Jordan. But once again, this was a piece that she had last month in February, in the New Yorker, waiting for resettlement in the age of Trump. Everything ends up being in the context of the age of Trump. Here's a project called Hidden Costs. It's about global supply chains. Again, we started this several years ago, tracing supply chains, whether it's electronic waste or illegal logging or shrimp production and the hidden costs of shrimp production in Thailand, a whole range of issues. One of our collaborators with the Global Reporting Center, Martha Mendoza, did a year-long investigation with the Associated Press on slavery in Asian seafood industry, found an entire island of slaves in Indonesia. Her story led to the freedom of several thousand slaves. It was a remarkable story. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service and virtually every other award in journalism last year. This picture is actually of a man who was enslaved on that island for a number of years and was finally free and seeing his family for the first time. This project as well is certainly at the risk of being hijacked by Donald Trump, because whether it's the broadcasters we're working with, media organizations, in this case it's PBS Frontline and Smithsonian and New York Times and Toronto Star, a range of major media organizations, or the funders we've been talking to, everybody wants some context for Trump. How is Trump changing trade? How is Trump changing regulation of companies, certainly U.S. Companies overseas, etc.? These are important issues to cover. There's no question about it. and journalists should be covering it. If your mandate, like ours, is to try to turn away from what everyone else is covering and try to cover the rest of the world and fill that gap, which I believe a nonprofit has that role and responsibility to do, it's really hard to do that when Trump is constantly bleeding into everything we do. There's another, I'll tell you about this one in a moment, but another project called Crisis in Democracy. We're working with a political science professor, Max Cameron at UBC, looking at the move towards illiberalism all over the world. Many countries, Hungary, Argentina, Philippines, a long list of them, that have had traditions of fairly liberal democracies have been moving more and more towards illiberalism. There's lots of reasons for that. It's a complex issue we thought worth addressing. But again, once Trump stepped into the stage, it was hard not to pay attention to him, not to pay attention to what's going on in the United States. And again, that ends up, all the light is there, and of course we tend to look at that and have to work it in some way. So our challenge has been finding ways of keeping to our mandate while also acknowledging this complexity. Here's another project called the Debala Project. Hey, you have a HDMI? Super. Don't able to speak yeah, I'll get my computer. But you know what, it's fine, it's fine. If I have to, I'll do it afterwards. Can I do this here? Yeah. Okay, thanks. I don't want to the flow. Debala is a town in Afghanistan where a wedding party was bombed by a drone, approved by President Obama himself, because he's had to approve every one of those drone strikes. All innocent people ended up dying in the middle of a wedding party. Sadly, not the only such story in Afghanistan. We have all sorts of investigations going on about it, and all sorts of different storytelling projects related to it. But I've been rethinking, should we kill this story? Because you know what's going on right now in Mosul with hundreds of civilian casualties under this current administration is probably just the opening salvo of a attitude of cavalier attitude towards civilian casualties that then renders what Obama had done with civilian casualties, with cracking down on whistleblowers, renders it quaint. The outrage that existed prior now just seems so negligible compared to. I was speaking with one of our collaborators today, a Pakistani woman, and we are working on a project about Islamophobia, working with the Ismaili Center here in Burnaby. And so I'm not Muslim, but she's Muslim, and we had two other people from the Ismaili Center who are Muslim, and we were all joking how we pined for the days of Islamophobia during Bush. Like, that was like the good old days. That was like acceptable Islamophobia in a weird, warped way, because today it's so dramatic that it's ramped up. Now, it's not to say that there wasn't obviously some complicity in the Bush administration and the Obama administration in a lot of these escalations. They set the bar at a certain point, and Trump came in, but he certainly carried the ball further along. So, question is, what do we do? What are the solutions as journalists and as scholars and as the public? We certainly can't not cover Trump. That's what he'd like, of course. He'd love to just kind of go about his way and have us ignore him. I'm going to see if one of these works. I think this next one might work. So I'll play that one for you, hopefully. Otherwise, I'll hook it up to my computer. But he's brilliant at deflecting and distracting us. It's like a game I used to play with my daughter when I'd wanted French fries. I'd tell her there's a dinosaur over there. She'd look away, and I'd take a French fry. But this is a much less innocent version of that game. When healthcare fails, he approves Keystone, hoping that people will talk about that. When more and more evidence of Russian collusion with his campaign happens, he tweets about Obama wiretapping him. I found this particular clip from Nancy Pelosi, the top Democrat in the House of Representatives, particularly interesting. So we'll see if it plays.
Do you have any idea what he's talking about? Well, the president, you know, is the deflector in chief. Anything to change the subject from where the heat is. And as one who has been engaged in intelligence, a member of the Gang of Eight for a long time, I can tell you that it's just ridiculous for the President Trump, to say that President Obama would ever order any wiretap of an American citizen, any president. That's just not, we don't do that. And so this is, it's called a wrap-up smear. You make up something, then you have the press write about it, and then you say everybody's writing about this charge. It's a tool of an authoritarian to just have you always be talking about what you want them to be talking about. Rather than Russia, we're talking about, did President Obama do thus and so?
So, you know, the level of kind of outrage, or level of certainly what the Trump administration and Trump himself are doing, has already, just a couple months into it, normalized things. And the fact that the Speaker of the House would call out the sitting president so strongly also is bizarrely gotten normalized. This, you know, a year ago, this would have been pretty dramatic statement, but this is where we are today. So, some suggestions, and you know, these are my humble suggestions, and really I want to open it up to all of you and hear particularly Bob's thoughts, but all of your thoughts on some of these issues. As journalists, I think we have an incredibly heavy responsibility to look for that manipulation and call it out. So when Trump tweets about the wiretap, the media was fairly good about saying unsubstantiated claim. So they did kind of fact check on that level, saying there's no apparent basis to this, he's saying this. But I would say take it one step further and say unsubstantiated claim put out there potentially or allegedly or maybe going insofar as accuse him of trying to deflect from another story. I think, you know, it's a sad commentary that we've had to kind of raise our own level of discourse to this point, but you see now the New York Times and other organizations outright calling Donald Trump a liar, stating that things he said are lies. Again, somewhat unprecedented for mainstream news organizations to make such statements, but we've all kind of keep raising the bar amongst ourselves. You know, the media, it took a long time for the media, and media sort of in kind of quotes, mainstream media, to look through the spin of both politicians and business leaders. Politicians and business leaders for the last several decades have been remarkably well trained. There's a multi-million, probably multi-billion-dollar industry around doing media training for leaders. I've interviewed a lot of these people who've gotten media training, and they are gifted and skilled at deflecting and not answering questions and kind of getting around and making it seem like they've answered a question. I work primarily in television, so we're always looking for that moment, that conversation, that soundbite. I had a situation a couple of years ago in Florida, some big investigation. We discovered all these horrible things the hospital was doing, and I was working with a correspondent at 60 Minutes, Steve Croft, who's a very good interviewer and a super tough guy in terms of the way he approaches interviews. And at the end of the interview, there was nothing I could use because this guy basically, it was like punching a marshmallow. Every time he'd kind of come up with a fact, he'd kind of give just enough to kind of get you to kind of move around him. So those folks have been really good at spin. And it took the media a long time to kind of start calling it out and saying this is spin. I think we're finally at that point where journalists are conscious of that and calling it out. But Trump has, of course, brought that spin to such a different level, and it's uncomfortable for most of us to make such bold claims about anybody, particularly a sitting president. But I do think that we need to kind of get to that point because it is simply reporting. You know, if there's something has happened, the president has, for instance, tweeted about Obama wiretapping him, and you know that it's a lie, and you know the motivations behind it. Why wouldn't you report that outright? So I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts on that in a few minutes. And I also think it's really important for us to, I mean, there was a honeymoon period, or nightmare period, whatever you want to call it, after the election where we're all kind of following the story and dealing with the fallout of Trump's election. But at some point we need to step back and realize that there is a big world out there, and there's a lot of things going on that, frankly, that the U.S. is doing that has nothing to do with Trump, that may be bad, that's worth investigating, and that plenty of other countries, including Canada and countries all over the world, that are doing that warrant attention and investigation and reporting. So at some point we need to step back. The notion of xenophobia and nativism in Europe certainly did not need Trump's help. It was alive and well when we were working on this for the last couple of years, long before Donald Trump even ran for president. And of course it has a long history going back centuries. Those stories deserve attention, deserve being told, and to some extent we do a disservice, I think, when we have to bring it back through the lens of the world of Trump. One of the goals of this Global Reporting Center that we're building is to challenge the kind of traditional methodology of foreign correspondence, which is parachute journalists from the West going to the Global South for brief periods of time, hiring up local fixers, having them essentially achieve our outsiders' vision of their country, their world, and telling audiences back home about the world through their eyes, why it matters to them. Frankly, it's what I've done a lot in my career, early on in my career, and it always bothered me, and I think the more and more I did it, the less comfortable I was. I always tried to do it in a way with as much integrity as possible, but ultimately the methodology itself, I believe, is flawed. So we've been trying to challenge that, but it is incredibly hard to do in the current climate. Likewise with trade. Slavery existed long before Donald Trump, as Martha Mendoza discovered. We shouldn't be allowing him to hijack those conversations. There are still huge human rights violations out there that have nothing to do with Donald Trump at this point, and perhaps he'll discover them and start escalating them, but those stories deserve attention. Keystone Pipeline. In any other situation, the approval of the Keystone Pipeline would have been front page news, huge news, would have dominated the news cycle, but it was barely a blip. It was barely a blip because, of course, everybody was paying attention to the Affordable Care Act's failure to be repealed and reformed. So he took advantage of that, passed this other thing, and we need to somehow create space in our brains for more than one story. And that's a huge problem in the media. The journalists themselves get obsessed with one story a day, and the public seems to, at least in terms of the studies of media organizations, the public seems to want to have one story a day, one big story a day. Two big stories a day is just somehow too much to bear. Trump, I guess I'll just sort of end with, and since I couldn't play some of the other clips, I want to just open up to you and get your thoughts. Trump's changed the rules of governance, and I think it's time for us as journalists to rewrite those rules as well. I don't have the answers. I don't know exactly what those rules are. I think we're all sort of fumbling through trying to figure out what those are. But the first step is acknowledging that those rules need to be changed. We cannot normalize this behavior. We have to call it out, and we have to change the way we approach reporting on the world. So I'll leave it at that, and open to your thoughts and questions.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
So perhaps we'll open it up in a sort of a town hall style.
Absolutely.
Way of doing things.
I have what at first will sound like a bit of a naive question, because I know what the answer is, but then I want to explain why I asked the naive question. And the naive question is, why is it so important to comment at all? And the reason that for example, why do reporters need to spend their time covering something that is so patently a lie, when there are other more interesting things to cover? And I know what you would say is that, it's important to report on the lie, and people need to know what the president is doing, blah, blah, blah. But the reason I ask this question is that it seems to me that the news media has lost control of distribution. So content and distribution used to both be controlled by media players, but of course distribution now is controlled in vast part by citizen distributors, not citizen journalists, because they're not producing their own content, but they are doing distribution.
Right.
And what happens is that they pick up the most salacious material and distribute it through Facebook a lot. And so that seems to change the motivation for what journalists would actually produce.
I think that's a really astute observation, that because we don't have the control that we used to have, this is what's on the front page of the paper, this is what's leading the broadcast. I mean, we still have some of that control, but a lot of that has been taken away by social media and basically sharing, and then of course we have the whole issue of echo chamber and the kind of politicization of social media. So I don't think it's a naive question at all. I mean, when my, I know we're recording this, when my, I won't say which gender, when my child, one of my children misbehaves, often has a huge temper tantrum, often my attitude is I will ignore that child because they're looking for attention and I don't want to give them the attention. And sometimes they escalate even further until they get the attention, but oftentimes it goes down, and in the process I can wash the dishes and actually something gets done. You know, in that analogy, we might go off and cover, you know, the challenge of treating RH disease in Nigeria while Donald Trump is tweeting about whatever bullshit he's tweeting about, and we're ignoring it. Should we have ignored, just taking the example that I gave of the Obama, the accusation that Obama was wiretapping? I mean, there's a couple layers to that. One is, and I would argue this is the main one, is in a corporate media landscape where profit is the motive, the goal. I mean, we saw this throughout the election. I didn't even touch on the election, but of course throughout the election, Donald Trump got, you know, whatever $1 billion worth of free media because when you put him on the screen, people watch. That was just the reality. The number is, you know, that's easy to track, and if you don't put him on the screen, everyone else is putting him on the screen, you're going to get fired. So that was just the kind of the gut level reality of journalists. So you had to put them on the screen. Same thing here. When he tweets that and then he misspells words, I mean, that's like manna from heaven for the media, because of course you want, you know, you're going to put that out there and people are going to watch it, they're going to talk about it, they're going to have CNN on or whatever on for hours and hours and hours listening to people debate it. So on that sort of corporate critique level, there's that reality. But you know, on that same level, you have public broadcasters doing the same thing, who may not have the same impetus to have you know, viewership. So on a secondary level, you have the issue of, okay, well, a significant part of the United States, at least, still likes Donald Trump. I mean, there are tens of millions and tens and tens and tens of millions of people who really like him, and lots more who kind of are fine with him. So there's the question, do you have a responsibility to hold him accountable when he does things like this? Because if you don't, they're just going to believe all that stuff. But the reality is, when we do hold him accountable, they don't believe what we're saying. I mean, the media mainstream media has a credibility rating, certainly as of a couple weeks ago, lower than Donald Trump. It's supposedly, I saw a survey recently that the media's crept a tiny bit above Donald Trump. It's a pretty low bar for us to have, but you know, we're in like the high 30s and he's in the mid 30s. We don't have a lot of credibility with mainstream American public. These are surveys in the US. So I don't have an answer, but I think that you're onto something in terms of maybe we need to think.
Care about whether Trump is or is not lying.
Yeah.
Right? In fact, they often are aware that these are lies, but they think, well, that's just fine because it serves a tactical purpose, because his goal is to shake things up and rattle the establishment, and this is how he's doing it. That's just fine with us.
Right.
So you've got a significant chunk of the electorate that doesn't seem to care about whether what he says is factually accurate or not, which means that, you know, the sort of Trump watch and tweet watch, the correction of his facts, might almost backfire.
It almost backfires, I agree.
Yeah. So I don't know what you do in that kind of circumstance, other than to say, let's change the agenda and try to look at something else as well, and focus on other issues. And we have to realize, you know, I mean, this kind of indifference to truth taken a really, almost an openly Leninist model, the magic prop. And I think some of its the current leaders of the alt-right describe themselves as kind of right-wing Leninists in that regard. But I don't see anything comparable to that on the left. I'm wondering if we, it's a bit late in the day now, if we need to do something like that. One thing I've imagined is a sort of our own website of fake news, openly fake news, about news we would like to see that should be happening, that isn't. And that's actually already been done on small scales temporarily. You've heard of probably guerrilla media, perhaps, that used to do news wraps, that do fake newspaper headlines. And that's been done, there's one done in New York that got really resonated with people. Like, it was a fake wrap that said, the oil industry is being nationalized. Things that, hardly like that happen. People think, wow, this is like my dream headline. This is what I'd really like to see happen. So I'm wondering...
The Onion is a little bit like that, but...
The Onion, yes.
But in a satirical.
Yeah. So anyway, I also, another final thought from me, for the moment at least, is that I wonder sometimes if we've, in media and cultural studies, communication studies, even critical journalism studies, have been a little bit complicit, unwittingly, in creating audiences that don't have enough respect for the virtues of traditional journalism. I'm wondering about my own teaching over the last 30 years, whether students go away thinking, well, it's all fake news anyway, and one opinion's as good as another. And if power intrudes into what seem to be objective accounts, why should I believe one account over another? So I'm rethinking about maybe we need to emphasize a little bit more about the distinction between journalism and propaganda or promotion, at least conceptually.
And it is tough to do that because the propaganda, the promotion has bled in so much.
And conceptual distinction.
But the public, and frankly often the journalists themselves, don't even understand those distinctions. And in Washington, and I've worked in Washington, this notion of kind of the quid pro quo, we're going to leak you something, and we're leaking this to you to either piss off the opposition or to float this with the public or whatever the political motivations are. There's always a motivation for a leak. I mean, other than, there's leakers who are trying to right wrongs, whistleblowers, but I'm talking about like insiders leaking with the complicity of their bosses, as Trump did throughout his career, would leak things, for propaganda purposes. And there is this sort of unwritten understanding that, you got to play the game. Run that story for me, and then next time I'll give you access. I had a situation during the Bush years where I was trying to get, at the time Colin Powell was the Secretary of State, and I was trying to get the State Department to do something for me, give me some information, and I was pressuring them, and this was one of the rare times it was not unwritten. They came back to me directly and they said, if you don't stop asking, we will cut off all of CBS News from the State Department, from all State Department briefings, from interviews with State Department folks. So that kind of level of gamesmanship certainly always existed and has only gotten worse. But the level of propaganda that has bled in is dramatic, and we don't call it out. And I love your idea of this sort of left-wing version of that. That same episode of The Daily Show, it's a good one, take a look at it, had this great little clip, I can't remember who it was some judge on Fox News who kind of goes on this rant about how Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, who supposedly authored the Trump Care health bill, needs to be fired. He's let down Trump, and he just kind of goes on this rant. And then the Daily Show producers cut to a recent news anchor in North Korea doing clearly propaganda, and the sort of cadence of the North Korean propaganda reporter was almost identical to this Fox News commentator. It was quite remarkable. And he did comment on it, but he almost didn't have to comment on it because there were these bizarre parallels.
Questions? It's over there, and then here.
Okay.
Could we take two at a time?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm all for you ignoring your child's tantrum, but in your household, you're the one with just want to hear, I want to be there in the Washington press corps reporting day after day what he's doing, because it's history like we've never seen before.
Yes, for sure. But okay, let's take the tantrum example. I think we, as the public, have a lot of power. Because, well, I mean, Canadian public didn't elect Donald Trump, thank God, but the American public did. And the American media, to some extent, were complicit in that. So if we ignore, let's just take the tweet. If somehow we all conspired to ignore Donald Trump's tweet about Obama, and we'd be like, ugh, yeah, whatever, like kids tantrum, like, oh, another tantrum, okay, I'm gonna go wash the dishes. He's another crazy tweet from Donald Trump, whatever, ignore it. You take away the power. Like, wouldn't you take the power away from him?
No, you don't, because he's still president of the United States and he can write executive orders. I would like to know, if I were a member of the American voting public, I would like to know exactly how crazy my president is, so that I could make an informed vote in the next election.
That didn't work this time.
It didn't work this time, and I don't know if we'll ever have it election again. I mean, it didn't work this time, right? The media did call out Donald Trump, certainly towards the end there.
Do you stop doing your job as a reporter because you don't get, because you have a political bias and the public doesn't vote the way you want it to vote? That's not what a reporter does. A reporter reports, and the consequences happen.
But I guess going back to sort of my premise, which is that, let's say, this is the front page of the paper. There's only so much space. If you take sort of mainstream media, like there's only so much you can cover. If all you're doing is covering Donald Trump, you are ignoring so many other important issues, not just in your own country, but all over the world.
No, I don't disagree with that. I think, but also where I and everyone else is still caught up in the newness of this.
Right.
And, you know, it'd be interesting to talk about this in 6 months and just see if in fact anything has calmed down in Washington, if anything is approaching normality, or if, golly, we're into an impeachment process over Russian collusion or goodness knows what. It's just so exciting at this moment that I want to know every tweet that comes out.
Yeah, it's like that little Chinese proverb, they live in interesting times. We literally live in interesting times.
Can I steal your thunder, Anise? Because I want to speak to this particular point. I promise it won't be long. I think if I can just play off of this particular point about whether or not Trump's power, whether in the executive seat or anything else, warrants the attention that it's supposed to warrant. Because in a sense, he may be a child throwing a tantrum on Twitter, but when he's in the Oval Office, he's not a child with a tantrum. He is someone with a significant amount of reach, impact, influence, and even though the executive orders are facing against the judiciary and there are branches of government that are pushing back, and there's a little bit of a tug of war, but he does wield a significant amount of influence. I think the mistakes that happened prior when he wasn't in this position was the fact that everybody bit a piece of the Trump pie. Everybody wanted it, and as you said, there was kind of that sort of profit-driven obsession that the corporate mainstream media has to operate on a basis of. And since everything's been corporatized in media by and large, with a few exceptions in the United States, that was the only model there. So the question becomes, if you ignore him on critical issues, I mean, and at what point, what becomes the barometer for when to ignore him and when to take him seriously? So Keystone gets ignored because there's a distraction somewhere else. It seems to me that he's using that tool of let them kind of yell and scream and shout, and I'm going to do something more worthwhile. He's doing the dishes, right? And we're the ones yelling and screaming. Right. So the question becomes, what is the barometer, and how do you calibrate the decision to report versus to let this pass? And does that reconstitute the questions around what it means to be doing journalism nowadays? Do we just abandon the whole idea of objective reporting, which is fraught with problematics, wholesale, and just be targeted in our critique of?
Well, so let's talk about the Affordable Care Act. So, the Affordable Care Act, Paul Ryan and the folks put a bill together. They endlessly compromised because they had the left and the right, and they couldn't get the votes. Trump had promised to repeal and replace Obamacare, and they didn't, and they failed in that. That took me 30 seconds to say, like, what do we need to talk about that more? Like, yes, we got it. We understand. We're not idiots. They screwed up, and it's embarrassing for Trump. So then we're just kicking sand in his face. We're then obsessed with, like, oh, Trump's such an idiot, he failed, and Paul Ryan, and, like, it's just endless talking about it while Keystone got it. So we're not focusing on important policy issues. Important policy issues, great, talk about it, and then move on. But we get obsessed with these issues. We get obsessed with topics. And even just to not to harp on this, but just as taking as a little case study, the tweet. The tweet was inconsequential about Obama. Whatever. Like, of course he's going to say some stupid thing. Now, if there are congressional hearings, by all means, report on congressional hearings and call out and say, congressional hearings were called waste of time, waste of money over some political ploy by the president. Report on that all you want. But the tweet itself was inconsequential. And yet it led to thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of discussion. Thousands of hours that we could have been discussing lots of other issues. Now, I know we're not all going to be talking about RH disease in Nigeria, like, no matter what the situation is, but there are other issues in the world that ultimately get ignored because we spent thousands of hours obsessing on these, stories which people want to see. People ultimately, going back to Bob's point, like, you don't have public engagement without the public, and you don't have public discourse with the public, and the public wants this stuff. And it goes back to a conversation that we constantly have in media studies and journalism studies and journalism schools of what is our, is it our responsibility, is it our duty to make decisions of what the public should see. In the old days, it certainly was. We would decide what Walter Cronkite is going to tell the country, and that was it. We decided what was on the front page of the New York Times. We set the agenda. We don't have that level of power anymore, but there still is some power. Reporters are still out there telling stories and putting it out there. The social media primarily feeds off of mainstream media that's produced, mainstream and partisan media that's produced. So we do have some control over that. Yeah.
I'm very tempted to write a book. I wonder if you'd like to be a co-author about misunderstanding Trump or his power. So my premise is that one of the problems with mainstream media, including the corporate ownership control media, is that to focus on his face value and focusing on his rhetoric that he deploys, but not focusing on the industry behind it that benefits from it there and carefully devised it. So Bob and you both mentioned about propaganda. So same kind of industry which was actually behind the LEAD program in the UK. We're talking about Cambridge Analytica, which is owned by Robert Mercer, a hedge fund billionaire who funded a $10 million for Breitbart for Trump's campaign. Also funded $13.5 million just as donation for Trump campaign. So this billionaire is behind a huge industry which is actually fueling psychometric profile analysis of voters of pro-Trump and anti-Trump vote, and carefully devising what kind of rhetoric can Trump use to deploy for distraction while you can get PS2 pipeline approved. And they are actually targeting, and here is another failure of mainstream media in terms of its political economy, is that to focus on coastal cities and the priority and agenda of the citizen and the readers of those urban areas, not focusing on Trump heartland, which you mentioned, is in the rural areas, or Midland America, where people, as you mentioned, there are a huge number of people like them. Why they like them? How has this been propagated? They use big data to anticipate what kind of things they want to hear. And this is not a coincidence that tweets he does. And the silly things that we take up on and spend hours and hours. Our failure as mainstream reporters is to not to see what is behind it and how it has been used in their advantage. No matter how stupid or negative, it looks counterproductive to Trump's publicity. It's no coincidence and it's no mistake. It is often often carefully planned, and we barely know about the shadow industry behind it. I wonder how does global reporting actually encounter, because as you said, we don't have $1 billion Robert Mercer to fund us for this big data analytics with public journalism.
No, it's a good question, and I've been intrigued by that whole Mercer phenomenon. Jane Mayer at the New Yorker and others have written extensively about it. I'm not, so I guess I'm not totally convinced that there is, I mean, all those facts, everything you said is true. So it's not like, I'm not discrediting what you've said. I'm not sure that Trump wouldn't be president with or without Mercer. Because his brand of sort of anti-establishment rhetoric, you know, as Bob said, like, the public knows he's lying. They don't care. The public knows he grabs women's crotches. They don't care, you know. I mean, I half wondered if Trump was behind that leak of that audio tape of him grabbing women. Because, I mean, who knows? I don't understand that mentality, but I would not be surprised if somehow, someday that came out, that either he or someone in his circle thought it makes him a guy, a locker room talk guy, you know? And I haven't seen the studies, if there have been studies, to see if that audio recording increased his popularity, but certainly didn't hurt his popularity with the people who were going to vote for him anyway. It hurt his popularity with people who weren't going to vote for him, but who cares? Those people are irrelevant. So yeah, I'm of two minds of whether there is this incredibly detailed and well-funded. With Brexit, there was, like, that's clear. With Trump, you know, I don't know if people can control him. You know, you saw one day when he gave his address to Congress, you know, I call it like Trump on his meds. Like, he just seemed to be coherent and sound and gave a, you know, everyone was like falling over themselves that he's presidential. Presidential because he read the teleprompter and he didn't tweet profanities. Like, that was somehow the bar that we've gotten to. But the next day he was off the rails again. So I don't know if you can control him. I have no idea. But I think this is a topic I think that does warrant some more attention. And again, it is a Trump story, but it's not the Trump story that he wants us to tell. And it's not the sexy Trump story that's going to sell, though. That's the thing, you know? New Yorker readers are going to read it, but the mainstream is not going to respond to it. And the Trump base is really not going to respond to it. I mean, I've talked to the Trump base. Like, there's some very smart people, but they believe in this kind of cause in a way that, you know, McCarthy's supporters believed in him, the way that Nixon's supporters believed in him. There's this kind of fervent belief in what he's doing no matter what. And even if Mercer's behind him, great, even better. He got $1 billion or $2 billion. $2 billion is better than one. So, sad commentary.
I think the only thing I would disagree with you, Peter, all that you've said, is when you use the phrase holding Trump to account. To hold somebody to account, you've got to be effective. And what's so stunningly obvious about the way the media has worked in the last 18 months or so is the stunning ineffectiveness of the media when it comes to telling the truth. Telling the truth doesn't seem to matter anymore. And I say this with regret as a lapsed journalist, as you know. And it seems to me that we have to rethink what it is we can do to hold the phrase speaking truth to power and holding people to account. I don't know what it is. Ignoring it in the way that you successfully on occasion do the washing up by ignoring your children might work in a domestic setting. You cannot, I must agree with the lady behind me, I don't think you can avoid covering the things that the president does, simply because they're so outlandish, so bizarre, so off the scale, and so unusual, that it's the uniqueness of the last, 18 months, but certainly since the inauguration on January the 20th, that makes it stunningly interesting from a journalistic point of view, but also politically necessary from a social democratic point of view. I don't think this is something we could or should ignore. Now, therefore, we have to decide, can the media any longer in the future speak truth to power and be effective and hold people to account? Or do we have to try and devise other organs are the institutions that have the authority to really hold people to account? I don't know the answer to this, and I think it's a place for debate. But when the media, the mainstream media, has been so thoroughly discredited, as you said, over the last 25 years, comprehensively and also strategically by the right, the mainstream media can no longer do it. It's quite evident. Something has got to change.
Yeah, no, I certainly see your point there. I mean, there's sort of two points in there. One, in terms of holding the power to account has to be effective. It's hard to gauge what is effective. So if the Washington Press Corps is holding Trump to account for whatever legislative thing or executive action he may be taking, the legislative branch and or the judicial branch might ignore that if the mainstream media doesn't make a big fuss about it.
Yeah.
So there is, I think we've already seen some, you know, if we all had ignored, for instance, the Muslim ban when it first happened, then, you know, a federal judge in Washington State and elsewhere may not have taken it upon themselves to do this, to be like, God, everyone seems fine with this, but I'm really putting my neck out here. But when they saw the public and the media respond in the way they did, they were like, all right, I got some cover here, I'm going to stick my neck out. And as happened again with Hawaii, when the second passed. So certain things, you know, going back, I sound like this terrible parent, but going back to I'm going to change the narrative.
I child services later.
I worked at a school for, school for wayward children. It's like the last stop before they went to prison. And right out of university. And there, our policy was, if a kid is agitating for the hell of it, ignore him. If the kid is poking the other kid in the eye with a pencil, obviously you have to intervene. But if you're constantly chasing the kids who are agitating, someone over there is going to poke someone in the eye and you're not even going to notice it. So I think that's what's happening. We're getting distracted by all of the kind of strump there that Trump is doing, and ignoring oftentimes the really significant issues. So, I mean, I agree. I think we ultimately need to just do our job and hold him and whoever else accountable for things that seem to be outside of the bounds of what they're supposed to be doing.
And just very briefly, to actually sound a little more optimistic than when I first spoke, I think the role of social media has been very important. For example, the Women's March just after the inauguration was not led by the mainstream media, it was by social media.
Yeah.
And that was a stunning international success. It couldn't have been organized by international broadcasters and international press. It had to be by international social media networks.
Yeah, the
So
same echo chamber that caused the problems, in some cases,
that's right.
can lead
That's
to
right. So there's the potential there for some for redemption, I think.
Yeah.
So, Catherine, you had another question. Anybody else?
Question, but
Yes.
sort of off topic.
That's fine.
She should go first. I already asked her. Okay, I was gonna say, kind of ties into what you're saying. When you think of the role of social media, for example, comments and public discourse around media, I guess that what I'm kind of wondering around is how do you find that balance between providing unbiased to some degree of moderation, right? Because even, for example, in this live stream right here, you get some inappropriate comments, you're going to have to deal with those, but it's how do you appropriately moderate that when that sense of like, should you be taking out something that relates to, let's say, fake news because it's propagating something that's fake, or should you not because that's a fair comment by a citizen who wants to talk about that and it's not violating inappropriate words, right? So I think that that balance is really hard to find right now, and I wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Well, are you referring to some extent to the trolls and the whole kind of phenomenon of trolls?
I wouldn't necessarily just call them trolls. I wish it was all trolls, which would be great, but because you could deal with that. But I think it's like that balance of variety of different opinions, and where some people do have opinions over they want to propagate this fake news. Let's say someone posts a comment and links to a fake news thing and uses that as an argument in your article in response to it. Now, should you moderate that out because it's not backed up, it's a fact that's not backed up, or should you allow it in for freedom of speech? right?
Right. Well, 60 Minutes this past Sunday addressed a bit of this. They went into the whole sort of Trump fake news factory, trying to, and there was a good piece today, I forget who had done it, that sort of held that piece accountable a little bit for being a bit tone deaf to the power of that machine of fake news. I mean, there's lots of types of fake news. There's the Trump accusations of mainstream media of being fake news. He has tried to take away the power of fake news by calling media fake news. But then there's the for-profit fake news, which was quite significant that may not have been politically motivated, but just it was clickbait. And then there's the politically motivated fake news. So I'll address specifically the politically motivated fake news. So I struggle with this a lot. As a target of trolls, I do not read comment sections of any story I've ever done because they're just filled with trolls, often anti-Semitic trolls, because people find out my parents were Holocaust survivors and then immediately, like, you should have finished them off, and the narrative is written. So when CBC, for instance, when they shut down comments for stories on Indigenous people, any kind of story that dealt with First Nations or T, whatever, they shut down comments because the comment section got so dramatically vile that they had no way of controlling it. And so they just, and it kind of goes to your issue of, like, where's that line, right? If you say that, you know, it's terrible that, you know, First Nations people are often drunk, okay, well, is that a trolling? Kind of. But it's certainly not as bad as a lot of things you see there, right? So then where do you draw that line? So they were like, we can't draw that line, so we're just going to shut it down. At first I was very uncomfortable with that as a journalist because I'm very much for free speech. And I mean, I support, right, as I say, my parents were Holocaust survivors, and I supported the rights of the neo-Nazis to march in Skokie, where my family, a lot of my family lived. They literally marched through my cousin's neighborhood. I'm totally for free speech. But in this context, where, as you say, it gets magnified and you link to fake news, there's a responsibility. You know, there's sort of this almost a quaint innocence of neo-Nazis marching through Skokie as the ACLU went and defended them, because most people kind of understood that context. The problem now is that a lot of it is out of context, and you see this fake news. I